The first of the two books I'll be looking at here is Katabasis, written by R.F. Kuang in 2025. The premise is one of my favorites in literature as I embark on my own academic journey. Alice Law is a grad student at Cambridge, and she sets out to rescue her advisor's soul from the 8 courts of hell. Not out of altruism, but because she needs to graduate. We get this right from the second paragraph of the first chapter. It was a terrible, gruesome accident that killed Professor Jacob Grimes, and from a certain point of view, it was her fault. And so for reasons of both moral obligation and self-interest, for without Professor Grimes she had no committee chair, and without a committee chair she could not defend her dissertation, graduate, or apply successfully for a tenure-track job in analytic magic, Alice found it necessary to beg for his life back from King Yama the Merciful, ruler of the underworld. Having checked with a few of my friends in higher education, I can say with some confidence that this is a perfectly normal occurrence for PhD students. As for how to travel to the underworld, Alice must create the correct magic circle to transport herself to hell. The first chapter explores the mechanics of how she achieves just that. From the start, you encounter her standing in a nearly complete ritual circle examining her work. She checked and double-checked her chalk inscriptions. She always left the closing of the circle to the end when she was absolutely sure that uttering and thereby activating the pentagram wouldn't kill her. One always had to be sure. Magic demanded precision. She glared at the neat white lines until they swam before her eyes. It was, she concluded, as good as it was ever going to be. Human minds were fallible, but hers less than most, and hers was now the only mind she could trust. She gripped her chalk, one smooth stroke, and the pentagram was finished. We learn from this selection a few things. First, the material used to create the circle is chalk. They discuss at multiple points throughout the book other details, which brands of chalk are best on which kinds of surface for which reasons, the sort of minutiae you'd expect from a world where this is a common studied practice. They compare chalk quality the way pretentious academics in her book Babel, one of my favorites, hierarchize the quality of one's education based on which translations of ancient texts they favor. We also get the key for activation, an incantation. The chalk markings are all preparatory. The last step in the ritual is an utterance, and that activates the magic. The time and mental taxation that went into reaching this final step are plainly evident. What isn't present is, of course, the aesthetic. We are left to fill the circle with our imagined shapes and sigils and all the little details. While we get more details later, the focus of this story is the setup, not the resulting appearance. See, for example, what happens when Alice is interrupted before she can commence her descent to hell. One Peter Murdoch arrives, an arrogant lad Alice knows and greets with the equivalent of a groan. "I know what you're planning," he says. "Sue's basic transportative pentagram with Satia's modifications," he said, which impressed Alice, since he'd only glanced briefly at the ground, and from across the room besides. "Ramanujan's summation with implications for the Casimir effect to establish a psychic link to the target, 8 bars for 8 courts." A grin split his face. "Alice Law, you naughty girl, you're trying to go to hell." Gah, what a character introduction, love it. Well, if you know that much, Alice sniped, you know there's only room for one of us. Peter knelt, pushed his glasses up his nose, and with his own stick of chalk quietly etched some alterations into the pentagram. This was very rude, one should always ask before altering another scholar's work, but standards of etiquette did not apply to Peter Murdoch. 1 becomes 2. Peter waggled his fingers. Abracadabra, now there's room. Alice double-checked his inscriptions and realized, to her dismay, that his work was perfect. She would have preferred he made an error that left him limbless. We get here descriptions without details, showing us not the shape of the circle, nor its contents, but the way inhabitants of this magic-imbued version of Earth talk about their craft. They don't just call these circles or pentagrams. The details, which shapes, words, names, inscriptions, and so on to use, are all encapsulated by names. We don't know what Sue's basic transportative pentagram looks like, but Peter clearly does. The fact that he can detect it at a glance suggests that whatever it is, it's a unique and identifiable pattern, and Alice's impressed reaction shows Peter's above-average skill. To me, this is an effective way to paint a picture for the reader without getting bogged down with all the details. It wouldn't work to say, picture 3 bands with these shapes and the following words and sigils. You can't really describe that. Kuang's approach strikes a nice balance between giving information and moving along, letting the reader fill in the gaps. It works well for me. Something that really makes my mind race with possibilities is this section's notes on how a magician could modify the recognizable patterns. You get whatever Satia's modifications are, portions of the circle that must have certain roles which let Peter identify the purpose of the ritual space, and edits that can expand the capacity of that ritual to include multiple subjects. This becomes even cooler if you start looking into these terms and contemplating what they might mean. The only one I couldn't find anything about was the first mention of one Tzu. The spelling diverges from the historical figures of Lao Tzu or Sun Tzu, but Kuang does pull pull from military history and philosophy a lot in her work, so I wouldn't be surprised if she had a reason in mind for connecting this specific name to a kind of pentagram, and I'm just not finding that reason. Similarly, the only Sati I could find was a philosopher, but he's a modern philosopher. That said, Kuang also pulls humor's existence is evidence of immortality 7 decades back to put a modern text in conversation with mid-20th century ideas. Why couldn't she be doing the same? Pulling Satia's contemporary ideas that morality can exist outside of reason, or of actions divorced from specific ends in mind, and apply these to magic. As we'll see soon, Alice Law is quite eager to act without regard to her eventual inevitable end, and the moral reasoning that drives her is not exclusively rational. The mentioned Ramanujan summation is a real thing, a mathematical technique for assigning a value to divergent infinite series. I'd love to elaborate on that, but I can't, honestly. This is what we're dealing with here, so, I don't know, you do it. But I will say, pairing the idea of an infinite series with the subsequently mentioned Casimir effect is especially interesting in light of, well, many spoiler-y things that happen to the characters throughout their Katabasis. I don't want to pretend to know more than the bare minimum about quantum mechanics, but if we take a basic summary of the Casimir effect, that 2 nearby conductive plates will be attracted to each other in a vacuum due to quantum fluctuations, and then we impose this on the development of the characters in the story, the parallels are striking. Even if you've never read the book, you could imagine the possibilities. 2 individuals, infinite series, realms of possibility, and uncontrollable fluctuations, resulting in 2 things being attracted and drawn to each other, no matter what kind of infinity they experience. These principles can be converted into a theme, connecting to magic as much as to the characters' paths. A fun thing to keep in mind if you do choose to read this book. Peter is saying a lot more than meets the eye with this paragraph. Now, these components are all sped through in the dialogue like they're ornaments, details, and a setting not meant to be the focus of the frame, but they make the scene as a whole feel more immersive, and they work spectacularly. They give a sense that one could look infinitely deeper into magic, study it from 1,000 angles and with any number of theoretical frameworks, to approach the ritual from unique perspectives and thereby achieve unique results. It feels like if you put in the mental work, you could excel and innovate in this world, but it would take grueling study of languages, physics, philosophy, mathematics, and fields you'd never even heard of before diving into this magical academy. The details in some are Kuang's magical aesthetics. You don't need to know what they mean any more than you need to recognize all the astrological symbols or scribbled incantations in fictional languages, but you don't have to understand the whole to appreciate the beauty that arises from the sum of its parts. Together, the details paint a picture of something realistic and complex, a puzzle that could be solved if you took the time to study it. This framing of the magic circle also turns its component parts into tools, something kind of like Lego bricks. Add this assembly here, take this piece out and put that in, build your own ritual. We see this characteristic a little later too, when Peter checks Alice's work. He says, "So maybe I'll do the Latin, and you do the Greek and Chinese." He peered down a segment near his right toe. "Say, why isn't this in Sanskrit?" "I'm not comfortable with Sanskrit," Alice said, peeved. This was just like Peter, condescending even when ostensibly asking for clarification. "I've done all the Buddhist sutra references in classical Chinese instead." "Oh," Peter hummed. "Well, that probably works. If you're sure." So key elements are needed, but specifics on how to include them are malleable. You need certain ideas or incantations, but if you find another language to communicate the same idea, it'll still work, as long as you've substituted elements correctly. It's like swapping ingredients in a recipe. Should be fine, just don't mess it up. This gives the circles a remarkable amount of flexibility in how parts can be combined and rearranged, allowing for different effects. I'm reminded of following along as a friend helped me build my computer. You can take a basic frame, add what you want, plug everything in, and customize your experience according to what you want to do with the device and how much you can afford. Magic circles are a technology in this world, and there's definitely a price. Alice hints at it in the end of the earlier selection, an error that could have left Peter limbless, but the cost isn't confined to errors. Shortly after this, Peter checks to verify Alice knows the price of this transaction that she's been setting up. Of course Alice knew. This was why scholars rarely ever went to hell. It wasn't that getting there was so very hard, you only had to dig up all the right proofs and master them. It was that a trip down below rarely justified the price. "Half my remaining lifespan," she said. Entering hell meant crashing through borders between worlds, and this demanded a kind of organic energy that mere chalk could not contain. 30 years or so gone. I know. Alice's lax dismissal of what for me would be an absolute deal breaker shows a lot about her character. It's also nice to see a limit on magic, a reason the characters of this world don't all just practice the craft and use it to solve every problem. With prices like that, who'd want to dabble in such arts? And that's the price if everything goes well. What happens when something doesn't go well is illustrated in quite vivid detail when we see just what killed Alice's professor. A bit of a content warning here, you may want to skip ahead if you get squeamish with gory details. In this selection, which is still in the first chapter, we see why Alice feels a sense of responsibility for what happened and just how high the stakes of the rituals can be. Let's look at those stakes. One might find it reckless, foolish even, for a magician to leave his life in the hands of underpaid and overworked graduate students. But for one thing, Professor Grimes' graduate students were the best in the world. For another, even graduate students at bottom-rate American institutions could identify the most dangerous mistakes in a pentagram. And this was Cambridge. After so many years of practice, they stood out to any competent scholar like glaring red flags, gaps in outer circles, misspelled words, false equivalencies, parentheses left unclosed. Anyone in a sound state of mind could have done it. But Alice was not in a sound state of mind that day. She was, of course, underpaid and overworked, but this condition was common among graduate students and no one cared much about it. But she had also not slept properly in 3 months. She'd drunk so much caffeine that the world shimmered and her chalk trembled in her grip. Uttering incantations invoked the living dead energy of chalk dust, and all that energy had an explosive effect unless contained properly within a defined space. Even the smallest hole could cause disaster. Therefore, anyone who drew a pentagram performed what was known as the ant test, tracing a pencil tip from one point of the inscription all the way around to make sure any ant following the line would complete the journey. Alice did not perform the ant test. She did not, in effect, bother to ensure Professor Grimes's body remained intact. And now the gruesome consequences of a missed error. No one knew in any official capacity that anyone was in that room on the day of the accident except for Professor Grimes. No one else saw when howling winds torn from infinite dimensions rushed into the pentagram. No one saw Professor Grimes' eyeballs stretch out of his face before popping like grapes, his intestines spooling out and around his body like a jump rope crisscross applesauce, his mouth twisting in a soundless scream. No one saw Professor Grimes' body turn upside down and spin for 7 horrible cycles, exposed organs rippling before flying apart in all directions, splattering every surface with blood and bone and guts. No one saw his brains on the chalkboard, the toothy jaw fragment landing plop into his afternoon cup of Darjeeling. And no one saw Alice strip naked in the lab shower, scrub herself clean, throw her clothes into the incinerator, and hurry out the back door, dressed in clothes from the overnight bag she always kept at the lab. No one saw her flee in the early hours across the campus back to her room in college, where she stripped down for a second shower and alternated vomiting and crying until she fell asleep. This section does a lot. In addition to setting the stakes for this and all future magical rituals, and as well as establishing the motives and augmenting the character of the protagonist, we get more glimpses into the mechanisms underlying magic in this world. First, the devil is, literally, in the details. Completeness and tidiness of the geometry, correctness of the inscriptions, and a reminder that swapping parts of the ritual for substitutes has its risks. The punishment for erroneous ritual also seems rather impersonal. This isn't, like we've seen in medieval manuscripts, a vicious, vengeful act of demons, but more like a natural consequence. Fool around while working with explosives and you might meet a destructive, though impersonal end. This is not the case in the next book. In the Amulet of Samarkand, the first release of the Bartimaeus sequence, written by Jonathan Stroud in 2003, you get the perspective not only of the magician, but of the demon being summoned by the magician's ritual. Bartimaeus is the demon in question, and the book starts with his grand entrance as 12-year-old Nathaniel summons him. The temperature of the room dropped fast. Ice formed on the curtains and crusted thickly around the lights in the ceiling. The glowing filaments in each bulb shrank and dimmed, while the candles that sprang from every available surface like a colony of toadstools had their wicks snuffed out. The darkened room filled with a yellow, choking cloud of brimstone, in which indistinct black shadows writhed and roiled. From far away came the sound of many voices screaming. The sulfur cloud contracted into a thick column of smoke that vomited forth thin tendrils. They licked the air like tongues before withdrawing. The column hung above the middle of the pentacle, bubbling ever upward against the ceiling like a cloud of an erupting volcano. There was barely a perceptible pause. Then 2 yellow staring eyes materialized in the heart of the smoke. Hey, it was his first time. I wanted to scare him. And I did, too. The dark-haired boy stood in a pinnacle of his own, smaller, filled with different runes, 3 feet away from the main one. He was pale as a corpse, shaking like a dead leaf in a high wind. His teeth rattled in his shivering jaw, beads of sweat dripped from his brow, turning to ice as they fell through the air. They tinkled with the sound of hailstones on the floor. What an entrance. In this introduction, we are granted not only an immersive sense of what it would be like to summon a demon, but also a glimpse of the mechanism behind the summoning. 2 circles are drawn, a pentacle where the demon will spawn, and a separate one for the magician. The latter decorated with runes to protect the magician from the terrifying being he is attempting to bend to his will. And there's a motive for the terror that Bartimaeus tries to inspire. Usually the best you can hope for is to give them nightmares later, but occasionally these stratagems are so successful that the apprentices actually panic and step out of the protective circle. Then all is well. For us. But it is a risky business. Often they are very well trained. Then they grow up and get their revenge. So I floated and waited, hoping he wasn't going to take too long to get round to the dismissing spell. To keep myself occupied, I made blue flames lick up around the inner edges of the pentacle as if they were seeking a way to get out and nab him. All hokum, of course. I'd already checked and the seal was drawn well enough. No spelling mistakes anywhere, unfortunately. We are getting a lot of information right off the bat, all achieved without feeling like lazy exposition, as the mechanisms are communicated alongside the demon's attempt at inspiring fear and looking for a way out of a summoning that's just begun. It's very effective storytelling. We see the purposes of the sacred geometry: protect the mage and position the demon. Inscriptions, if correct, will aid in the binding of the demon's power, and the demon can be dismissed with an utterance. There's even a hint at the stakes for Bartimaeus too, something about revenge, implying the magician can punish the demon as well as bind them. So far, Stroud is presenting a ritual very reminiscent of how practitioners described their craft in grimoires of the late Middle Ages and early modern period. The distinct position for a demon, be it a pentacle, triangle, vessel, or some other designated object like a skull, kept separate from the protective enclosure for the magician, with inscriptions and incantations to bind the summoned spirit to the magician's request, are all very true to form. Let's look at the boy magician's first command. I charge you to get on with it. Tell me your name. That's usually how they start, the young ones. Meaningless waffle. He knew and I knew that he knew my name already, otherwise how could he have summoned me in the first place? You need the right words, the right actions, and most of all, the right name. I mean, it's not like hailing a cab. You don't get just anybody when you call. Bartimaeus, of course, follows the boy's command, and we see it phrased as a quite shaky command. I charge you. Later, Nathaniel even says, by the constraints of the circle, the points on the pentacle, and the chains of the runes, I am your master, you will obey my will. These are adjurations, orders, a key component of necromantic rituals, and Bartimaeus tells us other components of the summoning ritual: words of power, actions, a number of which are attested in the grimoire tradition, and specificity with names. There is no flexibility here like what we saw in Katabasis. Screw up the formula, and you're screwed. I love how it's put while Bartimaeus drearily waits for the command. The kid cleared his throat. This was the moment. This is what he'd been building up to. He'd been dreaming of this for years, when he should have been lying on his bed thinking about racing cars or girls. I waited grimly for the pathetic request. What would it be? Levitating some object was a usual one, or moving it from one side of the room to the other. Perhaps he'd want me to conjure an illusion. That might be fun. There was bound to be a way of misinterpreting his request and upsetting him. One magician demanded I show him an image of the love of his life. I rustled up a mirror. Again, what we get here is precedented in the medieval corpus. Illusions, acts of thaumaturgy, revelations, hints at magic performed to win love or seeking revenge against foes. This last one is the motive for Nathaniel's actual command when he says, quote, I charge you to retrieve the Amulet of Samarkand from the house of Simon Lovelace and bring it to me when I summon you at dawn tomorrow. Hidden knowledge, the acquisition of treasure, matters of thievery, these are all quite common in grimoires, and they are infused in Nathaniel's order. Later in the story, we're given accounts of Nathaniel's magical instruction, which gives us more insight into the mechanisms behind the rituals. For example, when one Miss Lutyens is working with Nathaniel on his drills, the boy asks why he has to spend time copying patterns over and over. She says, sketching is all very well for artists, Nathaniel, or for rich young women with nothing else to do. You are not going to become an artist or a rich young woman, and the purpose for you picking up your pencil is very different. You are to be a craftsman, a technical draftsman. You must be able to reproduce any pattern you wish, quickly, competently, and above all, accurately. He looked dismally at the paper resting on the table between them. It showed a complex design of branching leaves, flowers, and foliage with abstract shapes fitted snugly in between. He was recreating the image in his sketchbook and had been working on it for 2 hours without a break. He was about halfway finished. The task seems as pointless as it is tedious to the magician in training, but he learns an important lesson when he objects to her pointing out a couple of his errors. It's only a small mistake, the rest's okay, isn't it? That's not the issue. If you were copying out a pentacle and you left a hole in it, what would happen? It would cost you your life. You don't want to die just yet, do you, Nathaniel? No. Well then, you simply mustn't make mistakes. They'll have you otherwise. The stakes are here reinforced, harkening back to how Bartimaeus scrutinized Nathaniel's work, eager to find some mistake, and the rigor is clear. A single missing bit could be detrimental. Exactness, precision, completeness, these are essential for the necromancer. Another of Nathaniel's mentors tries to embed the importance of precision, or else, in Nathaniel's mind. What must one never forget? Demons are very wicked and will hurt you if they can, sir. His voice shook as he said this. Good, good. What an excellent memory you have, to be sure, but careful how you pronounce your words. I fancy your tongue tripped over itself there. Mispronouncing a syllable at the wrong time may give a demon just the opportunity it has been seeking. Oof, no mispronunciations allowed. I would die so fast. So, throughout the ritual, the magician should be constantly vigilant. The use of a magic circle isn't a moment, it's a negotiation, the space in which the mage and demon engage in a battle of wits. The loser is subject to the winner's mercy. As part of that battle, the demon is not without options. In addition to their longevity, cleverness, powers, and opportunities they may detect in imperfect geometry or utterances, they may also acquire the magician's name. The power associated with names goes both ways, a detail I love, though I don't know of any medieval precedent for this. When you are 12 years old, 2 important things will happen. First, you will be given a new name, which you shall take as your own. Why? To prevent demons getting power over me by discovering my birth name, sir. Correct. Enemy magicians are equally perilous, of course. Secondly, you will get your first pair of lenses, which you can wear at all times. This will allow you to see through a little of the trickery of demons. Until that time, you will use these glasses, but only when instructed to, and on no account are they to be removed from this workroom. Understood? Yes, sir. How do they help me see through things, sir? When demons materialize, they can adopt all manner of false shapes, not just in this material realm, but on other planes of perception too. I shall teach you of these planes anon. Do not question me on them now. Some demons of the higher sorts can even become invisible. There is no end to the wickedness of their deceptions. The lenses, and to a lesser extent the glasses, allow you to look on several planes at once, giving you a chance of seeing through their illusions. Together with the importance of the magician's own name, we learn here what is definitely precedented in the medieval tradition, the illusion powers of demons. Some historical practitioners went so far as to say all demonic powers are false, from illusory blessings to deceit masquerading as divination or wisdom. Nathaniel's master emphasizes this in a harsh but necessary lesson. The summoning began as a deep disappointment. After the incantations, which Nathaniel was pleased to find he largely understood, nothing seemed to happen. A slight breeze blew through the workroom, otherwise all was still. The empty pentacle stayed empty. His master stood close by, eyes shut, seemingly asleep. Nathaniel grew very bored. His legs began to ache. Evidently, this particular demon had decided not to come. All at once, he noticed with horror that several of the candles in one corner of the workroom had toppled over. A pile of papers was alight, and the fire was spreading. Nathaniel gave a cry of alarm and stepped. "Stay where you are!" Nathaniel's heart nearly stopped in fright. He froze with one foot lifted. His master's eyes had opened and were gazing at him with an awful anger. With a voice of thunder, his master uttered the 7 words of dismissal. The fire in the corner of the room vanished, the pile of papers with them. The candles were once again upright and burning quietly. Nathaniel's heart quailed in his breast. "Step outside the circle, would you?" Never had he heard his master's voice so scathing. "I told you that some remain invisible. These are masters of illusion and know 1,000 ways to distract and tempt you. One step more and you'd have been on fire yourself. Think of that while you go hungry tonight. Get up to your room." As a final scene, I want to look at the moment Bartimaeus delivers the stolen amulet to Nathaniel. The Amulet of Samarkand. It was Simon Lovelace's. Now it's yours. Soon it will be Simon Lovelace's again. Take it and enjoy the consequences. I was asking about this pentacle you've drawn here. What are these runes? This extra line. The kid puffed out his chest. Adelbrand's pentacle. If I didn't know better, I'd have sworn he smirked, an unseemly facial posture for one so young. Adelbrand's pentacle. That meant trouble. I made a big show of checking the lines of the star and circle, looking for minute breaks or wiggles in the chalk. Then I perused the runes and symbols themselves. Unfortunately for Bartimaeus, he discovered no such errors. This moment shows an element comparable to that seen in Katabasis. Names exist of specific geometric arrangements, possibly discovered by an experimenting mage, and meaning that the shapes themselves do play a role with the inscriptions and incantations with regards to just how the ritual will unfold. The use of runes is interesting too, inviting the magician to expand beyond the Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic common in the medieval magic circle. Kuang adds Chinese and Sanskrit, and Stroud adds Old Norse or Anglo-Saxon. I love it. Here's how Bartimaeus describes the effect of this alternate arrangement. Most ordinary pentacles bind you to one service only. Carry it out and you are free to go. If the magician requires you again, he must repeat the whole draining rigmarole of summoning from the beginning. But Adelbrand's pentacle countermanded this. Its extra lines and incantations double-locked the door and forced you to remain for further orders. It was a complex magical formula that required adult stamina and concentration. So, the geometry can impact the extent to which the demon is bound to the magician's service, and either the ritual or the increased demand on the demon requires more from the magician too. Stamina and concentration. There are physical and cognitive elements required through the ritual, not just a successfully crafted ritual space and executed incantation. Nathaniel has Bartimaeus place the amulet in a vessel located between the pentacles, and he retrieves the vessel with a crude hook to inspect it from the safety of his own circle. I like this, as few renditions of magic circles I've seen in modern media employ material components as an active part of the ritual itself. A few consider the materiality in the setup of the ceremony, but not throughout it. Solomon famously used a brazen vessel, according to the Lesser Key of Solomon, and containers for incense were a common element of medieval magic circles, but I like this as a method of obtaining the treasure. I've seen objects placed at key locations in a circle or treasure delivered by a demon and just dumped on the ground, but having seen how carefully Bartimaeus looks for a moment to trip up Nathaniel, I think this is a great way to demonstrate the magician's caution. A command to drop the item could have required Nathaniel leave the safety of his circle to verify the object's authenticity, but other phrasings to have it delivered to him in his own pentacle might have given the demon ways to interpret the adjuration quite liberally and dangerously. I thought this was very well handled, and this is exactly how Bartimaeus thinks as he receives his second command, the last I will highlight from this book. Nathaniel calls Bartimaeus by name and says, I charge you to take the Amulet of Samarkand and hide it in the magical repository of the magician Arthur Underwood, concealing it so that he cannot observe it, and achieving this so stealthily that no one, either human or spirit, on this plane or any other, shall see you enter or depart. I further charge you to return to me immediately, silent and unseen, to await further instructions. He was blue in the face when he finished this, having completed it all in one straight breath. Strictly advisable when dealing with subtle, intelligent entities such as myself. It is often possible to interpret a pause for breath as a full stop, which either changes the meaning of the instructions or turns them into gobbledygook. If we can misinterpret something to our advantage, we most certainly will. To conclude my book analysis, here are my notes on the circle in Katabasis, and here are my notes on the circles in the Amulet of Samarkand. On the aesthetic ritual spectrum, I would rate Katabasis slightly higher than the Amulet of Samarkand, but only because of the former's extra emphasis on more of the ritual components, like the setup, a price for a specific ritual, and the purpose of any given modification as a whole. But in the end, both are heavily focused on the ritual aspect, with only cursory mentions made of the aesthetics. The reason for this, I think, is quite obvious. This is a book, not a visual medium. Every detail the author wants in the reader's mind must be directly addressed, or else freedom is yielded to the reader to fill in the blanks themselves. For an author to focus on the details of each circle would be tedious, but the experience of the magicians in creating and using the circles is easier for a reader to identify with. They can imagine the circle themselves, which I actually love. As I imagine the circle taking form, I, the reader, am becoming a co-creator with the magician. In both games and books, the audience takes part in the magic, but in different ways. In games, we use the circles that characters have created. In books, we create the circles that the characters are using. How would this compare with a medium in which the audience is more passive? Let's look at two different approaches in visual media.